everyone. My name is Angela Thorne, and today we're going to be talking about transitions. When my son was 5 years old, I had no idea that he was on the spectrum. I knew that he loved to lay down on the bed as a baby and look up at the ceiling and see the fan spin. I knew that he loved trains, and I knew that when we went from one activity to another, sometimes it would prompt a meltdown. So one day when he was 5 years old, I decided to take my oldest son to Barnes and Noble to play with the big wooden train set in the middle of the store. So we went in and he was having the time of his life. And I had learned that I needed to give him a warning before it was time to leave. So with around 5 minutes before it was time to leave, I was like, hey, Jay, we have 5 minutes and then you're going to need to go. You're going to need to be ready to leave the store. And he kept playing. When it got to be 1 minute, I was like, hey, Jay, we have 1 minute and then you're going to need to be ready to go. And he was like, okay, Mom. He kept playing with his trains. And when it was time to go, I was like, hey, we got to pack up our stuff. We got to go. He just screamed at the top of his lungs and went limp on the floor in the middle of the store, in public, crying, screaming. You could look at this in a judgmental light towards me as a parent or towards him as a child. Like, what was he thinking? He had a warning and he chose to behave that way. But, even adults have trouble transitioning. Example one, a lot of us, when we get home from work, we sit in the car to help us transition. Example two, a lot of us after work, when we're in the car and we're driving, we put on music to help us with that transition. As adults, we have things that help us to go from one thing to another, and we often don't even think about it. So before casting judgment, remember that transitions can even be hard for adults. There was this one student I had in kindergarten, little kindergartner, we'll call her Laura, not her real name, who would often scream at the top of her lungs whenever she had to go to PE or art or music. She would walk down the hall with the class and they would all go in and she would just stand out there. And the teachers would try and get her in and she would just refuse to move. She would not budge. So I'm going to share with you what we did to help Laura transition. The first step was to get curious. What is Laura interested in? She loved letters. She was obsessed with letters. She loved how they were shaped and she liked to draw them with her finger. She loved how they sounded and she knew all the letter names and all the letter sounds and she could read. She couldn't understand what she was reading, but she could decode like a pro. So that was our starting point. But also, what other things were making transitions difficult for her? She was losing access to her preferred activities by transitioning, but also in PE, it was very loud in there, and it was hard for her to go into someplace so loud. The next thing we did was we looked at our structures for transitioning. This is where we talk about universal design. We start with the routines that everybody is doing, because sometimes that's enough, right? Universal design, in case anyone wants a review of what that is. Cut curves are an example of universal design. They're designed for wheelchair users, but anyone can use them. And they're useful for parents who have strollers, who are rolling their kids around, who need to be able to get in and out of buildings and in and off of sidewalks. So we look at the routines first, because that way we can ensure that we're using universal design to help all of the children. In this particular kindergarten classroom, we had a routine where the kids would line up and they would say, my eyes are facing forward, I'm standing straight and tall, my arms are to my side, I'm ready for the hall. And this worked really well for this group. And they would walk down the hall quietly, and that worked pretty well for Laura, so there was no reason to change that because it was working for her. But what wasn't working was getting into the classroom. So that's where we have our step 3, where we tailor additional supports to the struggling learners, the people that are really just having a hard time. So we know that Laura loves letters, but you know what else Laura really loved? She loved logos. So her preferred activity was to look at logos. One thing that we did to help her transition into art was we had a binder and we filled them with logos. logos that Laura loved. And behind all of these colorful logos, we had blank paper where she could draw the logos herself. And we had crayons. So she had all the materials that she needed. And so in addition to all of our classroom routines, just before Laura would transition into art or into PE, I would hand her one of these books that had the logos in it. And she could be looking at the logos all the way down the hall. That really eased the transition. And this was the only time that she was allowed to have this book that she loved. We call this temptation bundling. And this worked great for art, and this worked great for PE. And it was pretty much enough by itself for art. But it was unfortunately not really enough for PE. Why? Because Laura also had some sensory things going on. Laura did not like the loud noises. She did not like the people running around in the chaos in PE with those high ceilings, right? So let's take a look at our sensory tools. The headphones are really what Laura needed to be able to make the transition into PE. But the headphones by themselves were not enough. She needed the headphones and she needed her book of logos in order to do that. What about when she gets into these classes and all of a sudden she's expected to do what the class is doing? That's an excellent question. So that's where we bring in our timekeepers. Going back to my story about my son and the trains, I told him when we had 5 minutes to go. I told him when we had 1 minute to go. I probably could have set a timer on my phone. Wouldn't have made a difference. He couldn't see it. He had no visual representation of what was happening. And that's why visual timekeepers are so important. Here are a few examples of visual timekeepers. You can use a 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 system where you cover the numbers so the child knows when the time is almost up. Or you can use the green, yellow, red stop system. And this is one of my favorite stop systems because it isn't necessarily set perfectly on a timer. There's a little more flexibility, but it's very clear when it's time to stop. And the child can look up and see. I will give you an example. I'm talking now. I'm going to keep talking. And when I get to stop, I'm going to stop this particular section and go on. The nice thing about this method is that while there are products on the line that you can buy that have the red, yellow, green method, and it works pretty well, you can also do it yourself. You can use cardboard. You can do it on the computer the way I'm doing it now. And so it doesn't have to be high tech. It's pretty simple. And then when you get to stop, the child knows to move on. Back to our opening scenario with my son and his trains. My son is 22 years old and he still loves trains. This is a photo of him and I at a train festival about a month ago. He works part-time. He goes to school part-time. He has good grades. And he is a railroader. He rarely has meltdowns anymore, and he does much better with transitioning. But it has not been an easy thing. It has been hard won over years and years and years. The thing that has helped him is telling stories. Well, I'm going to give you a quick formula for how to tell a story that will help a child who's trouble with transitions to transition better. And the formula is describe, describe, direct. First step is to describe the situation. Set the scene. My name is Jay. I love the trains at Barnes & Noble. They make a soothing sound as they roll along the wooden tracks. If I could play trains all day, I would. Do you see how it's in first person and it's from his point of view? This is really important. It needs to be something that he would actually think and say, something that he can relate to. It needs to feel like it is about him and not like you have written this for him, which is why even if you can get the child to help you write this story, it works even better. See the sensory details in this? Soothing sound of the wood as the wheels roll along. This is great because it puts him right there and it captures his mindset. If I could play trains all day, I would. It rings true. But if I never stopped playing with them, when would I eat or sleep? This person who's having trouble transitioning needs a reason to transition. And it's better if that reason isn't connected to my adult really wants me to. It's better if that reason is connected to something that they can logically see matters. What matters more than eating or sleeping? Not much, right? I need time for that stuff too. Plus, other kids should also have a chance to play with the trains. This worked for him because he has a sense of justice, which is really quite wonderful. Now, you will notice I put a little asterisk by feelings. I did this because, in the case of my son, he's in touch with his feelings and he can talk about his feelings, but not every child can. In fact, children who can't have, I think, what we call alexithymia, which means, of course, they have all the feelings of everyone else, but they may not be able to identify them or talk about them. You can still use this method with children who have that, but I think you would focus less on feelings and more on things that they can put into words. Describe the transition and what will happen. My adult will set a visual timer, so I will know when it's time to stop playing with the trains. I may feel anxious or sad when the end of playtime approaches, and this is okay. Do you see how we are validating his feelings here? We're not telling him his feelings are wrong. We're not telling him he shouldn't feel that way. We're saying, that's okay. You're allowed to feel sad. You're allowed to feel anxious. I can feel these things without yelling or throwing myself to the ground. There's our target behavior right there that we are seeking to change. But we've not directed him to change that behavior yet. We're just describing it, and we're telling him it doesn't have to be that way. I can say I am sad, replacement behavior. I can say I am anxious, or I can express my feelings through drawing. Direct. I will take a long, slow breath and stop playing with the trains when the time is up. I will walk with a calm body and quiet hands away from the trains. If I feel sad, I will remind myself that we'll come back and play with the trains again. I will draw a picture to feel better. So, with my son who loved to draw, we were able to use something else that he really enjoyed to help him redirect. And that concludes our presentation today. But to sum up, I'm going to give you this little cheat sheet. If anyone has any questions, you know where to reach me. I hope you have a wonderful day.